In Manhattan's gleaming Sterling Capital offices, Amira Hassan, a brilliant junior portfolio manager, faced the most humiliating conversation of her career when HR Director Patricia Webb suggested she remove her hijab to make clients more comfortable. For 2 years, Amira had proven herself in the cutthroat world of high finance through her analytical brilliance and uncompromising principles, only to be told her religious identity was a barrier to advancement. What Amira didn't know was that her family held a $3 billion secret that would turn the tables completely. When she confided in her father about the discrimination, she discovered that her quiet immigrant parent was actually the CEO of Crescent Holdings, the very investment firm Sterling Capital had been desperately trying to court for months. What began as religious discrimination would become corporate justice on an unprecedented scale, forever changing the prestigious firm that had underestimated both her worth and her family's hidden power. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sterling Capital's 32nd floor conference room, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table. Amira Hassan adjusted her navy blazer one final time and glanced at her reflection in the glass surface of the table. Her hijab, a soft charcoal silk that complemented her professional attire, was perfectly arranged, neither too loose nor too tight, striking the balance she'd perfected over years of navigating corporate environments. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus Sterling III announced from the head of the table, his silver hair catching the light as he gestured toward their guest. "I'd like you to meet James Morrison from Meridian Pension Fund. James, these are some of our finest portfolio managers." Amira felt her pulse quicken as Morrison's eyes swept the room, taking in the assembled team. At 50-something, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the bearing of someone who'd earned his position through merit rather than inheritance, he seemed genuinely interested in what Sterling Capital had to offer. When his gaze settled on her, she saw curiosity rather than judgment, a refreshing change from some of the firm's more traditional clients. "Ms. Hassan," Marcus continued, "will be presenting our emerging market strategy." Standing smoothly, Amira moved to the presentation screen with the confidence that had carried her through Wharton and into the competitive world of Manhattan finance. She'd spent weeks perfecting this analysis, diving deep into economic indicators, political stability metrics, and currency fluctuation patterns across 17 different markets. This was her element, pure analysis, where numbers told stories and trends revealed truths that most people missed. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling." Her voice was clear and assured as she clicked to the first slide. "Mr. Morrison, Meridian's portfolio currently has a 7% allocation to emerging markets. Our analysis suggests this is leaving significant returns on the table." The presentation flowed like a carefully choreographed dance. Amira walked Morrison through her research methodically, building her case with the precision of a master craftsman. She highlighted the demographic dividends in Southeast Asian markets, the infrastructure investments driving growth in Eastern Europe, and the technology leaps happening in Latin America that traditional analysts were overlooking. "These charts show correlation patterns that most firms miss," she explained, pointing to a complex visualization she'd created. "When you look beyond the obvious indicators and examine secondary economic signals, mobile phone penetration rates, university enrollment numbers, urbanization velocity, you see opportunities that won't be obvious to the broader market for another 18 months. Morrison leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "Walk me through the Indonesian analysis again. Your projections seem aggressive." Amira smiled, sensing the genuine engagement behind his question. This was why she loved finance, the moment when data and intuition aligned to reveal hidden patterns. Indonesia's middle class is expanding by 12% annually, but here's what's interesting. She clicked to a detailed breakdown she'd prepared. Government infrastructure spending is creating a multiplier effect that traditional models underestimate because they don't account for the cultural shift toward digital banking. For the next 20 minutes, Morrison peppered her with increasingly sophisticated questions. Each one revealed his deep understanding of global markets, and each of her responses demonstrated the thoroughness of her research. She fielded inquiries about currency hedging strategies, political risk assessments, and correlation analyses with an ease that came from months of preparation and years of study. "Your risk-adjusted return projections," Morrison said, leaning back in his chair. "They're based on a 5-year timeline?" "Conservative 5-year, optimistic 3-year," Amira replied without hesitation. "But, Mr. Morrison, if I may." She clicked to her final slide, one she'd debated including until the last moment. "These projections assume traditional Western investment approaches. In my experience, and I've spent considerable time in these regions, there are cultural and business practice nuances that can significantly enhance returns if properly understood." The room fell silent. Amira felt the weight of eyes upon her, but Morrison's expression remained thoughtfully engaged. "Explain," he said simply. "Take the Malaysian palm oil sector," she began, her confidence building with each word. "American firms typically approach partnerships there like they would in Dallas or Detroit. But Malaysian business culture emphasizes long-term relationship building, extended decision-making processes, and family business dynamics that span generations. Firms that invest time in understanding these cultural frameworks, really understanding them, not just paying lip service, consistently outperform by 15 to 20%. From the corner of her eye, Amira noticed Patricia Webb shifting in her seat near the back of the room. The HR director had arrived quietly during the middle of the presentation, her blonde hair pulled into its signature tight bun, her expression unreadable as she observed the proceedings. Patricia's presence always made Amira slightly uncomfortable. There was something calculating in how the woman evaluated everything and everyone, as if constantly assessing risks and benefits from a purely corporate perspective. Morrison was nodding thoughtfully. "Ms. Hassan, your background. You have experience in these markets personally?" "My family immigrated from Lebanon when I was young," Amira replied carefully, aware that personal information could be a double-edged sword in these settings. "I've maintained connections throughout the Middle East and have spent summers working with investment firms in Dubai and Beirut. It's given me insights into how Western capital can be more effectively deployed in emerging markets." "Fascinating." Morrison turned to Marcus. "This kind of cultural intelligence is exactly what we're looking for. Too many firms treat emerging markets like exotic stock picks rather than complex ecosystems requiring nuanced understanding." Marcus beamed, clearly pleased with how the presentation was unfolding. "Ms. Hassan is one of our brightest analytical minds. Her approach to research is exactly the kind of innovative thinking that sets Sterling Capital apart." As the presentation concluded and the team began filing out for lunch, Morrison approached Amira directly. "Ms. Hassan, that was exceptional work. The level of detail in your risk assessments, combined with the cultural insights, it's rare to find that combination. I'd like to schedule a follow-up meeting to discuss implementation strategies." Warmth spread through Amira's chest as she shook his hand. "I'd be honored, Mr. Morrison. Thank you for your thoughtful questions. They really pushed me to articulate the nuances of the strategy." "That's exactly what we want in a partnership," Morrison replied. "Managers who can think on their feet and defend their positions with data and insight, not just sales pitches." As Morrison left with Marcus to continue their discussions over lunch, Amira gathered her materials, still glowing from the successful presentation. David Chen, her mentor and one of the few senior executives who'd consistently supported her advancement, approached with a genuine smile. "Outstanding work, Amira," he said quietly. "That was the kind of presentation that builds careers." She was about to respond when she noticed Patricia Webb still lingering near the doorway, her pale blue eyes fixed on Amira with an expression that seemed to be calculating something. When their eyes met, Patricia offered a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes before turning and walking away. A small chill ran down Amira's spine, though she couldn't articulate why. The presentation had gone better than she'd dared hope. Morrison had been genuinely impressed, Marcus had publicly praised her work, and David's approval meant more to her than any official recognition. She should be celebrating. But as she packed her laptop and notes, Patricia's lingering presence nagged at her. In her 2 years at Sterling Capital, she'd learned to read the subtle currents of office politics, and something in the HR director's expression suggested that her moment of triumph might have consequences she hadn't anticipated. Still, standing in the conference room where she'd just delivered the presentation of her career, Amira allowed herself a moment of pure satisfaction. She'd proven herself on merit, demonstrated her expertise, and earned the respect of a sophisticated client. Whatever came next, she'd know that her success was built on substance, not politics. The autumn sunlight that had seemed so promising 2 days earlier now felt harsh and clinical as it streamed through Patricia Webb's corner office windows. Amira sat rigidly in the ergonomic chair across from Patricia's glass desk, her hands folded carefully in her lap, trying to project the same confidence she'd felt during the Morrison presentation. But something about being summoned to HR always made her feel like a student called to the principal's office, regardless of the reason. "Thank you for coming, Amira," Patricia said, her voice carrying that particular brand of corporate warmth that felt practiced rather than genuine. The HR director's office was a study in calculated approachability, motivational posters featuring diverse faces, awards for workplace inclusion initiatives, and a small collection of international flags. That seemed more decorative than meaningful. "Please make yourself comfortable." Amira's eyes swept across the wall behind Patricia's desk, taking in the framed certificates. Diversity Champion Award 2023. Inclusive Leadership Recognition. Building Bridges Across Cultures. The irony wasn't lost on her, though she kept her expression neutral. "I wanted to have what I like to call a career development conversation," Patricia continued, settling into her chair with the fluid movements of someone completely at ease in positions of authority. Her blonde hair was pulled back in its signature severe bun, not a strand out of place, and her navy suit was pressed to perfection. "Your presentation the other day was quite impressive. Mr. Morrison was clearly engaged." "Thank you," Amira replied carefully. "I'm grateful for the opportunity to present to such a sophisticated client." Patricia smiled, but there was something calculated in the expression. That's exactly the kind of attitude we love to see. Ambition, competence, drive. You have all the qualities we value at Sterling Capital. She paused, reaching for a leather portfolio that sat closed on her desk. "Which is why I wanted to discuss some feedback I've received." Amira felt her stomach tighten slightly, though she maintained her composed expression. "Feedback? Now, I want to be clear from the outset that this conversation comes from a place of wanting to support your career advancement," Patricia said, opening the portfolio and glancing at notes that Amira couldn't see. "At Sterling Capital, we pride ourselves on being a forward-thinking organization that values diverse perspectives and backgrounds." The HR director's tone remained pleasant, but Amira detected something underneath, a careful choosing of words. That suggested this conversation had been rehearsed. Patricia had built her career on these kinds of delicate discussions, navigating sensitive topics with corporate speak that obscured as much as it revealed. "I've had some conversations with colleagues and, well, some of our more traditional clients," Patricia continued, her fingers drumming lightly against the portfolio, "and there's been some concern expressed about client comfort levels during presentations." Amira's pulse quickened, though she kept her voice steady. "I'm sorry. Could you be more specific about the nature of these concerns?" Patricia's smile became even more practiced. "Well, you know how it is in our business. Perception can be just as important as performance, especially when we're dealing with conservative institutional investors. Some of our clients come from very traditional backgrounds, and they can sometimes feel uncertain about approaches that seem unfamiliar to them. The words hung in the air like smoke, their meaning clear despite the euphemistic packaging. Amira felt heat rising in her cheeks, but forced herself to remain professional. Are you referring to my analytical methods? My presentation style? Oh no, nothing like that, Patricia said quickly, waving her hand dismissively. You're technical? Competence is unquestionable. It's more about, how shall I put this? Ensuring that our clients feel comfortable and can focus entirely on the substance of what you're presenting without any potential distractions. Amira's throat felt tight. Distractions? Patricia leaned forward slightly, adopting what was clearly meant to be a confidential mentor-to-mentee tone. Amira, I want to be direct with you because I believe in your potential. I've received some anonymous feedback suggesting that certain aspects of your appearance might be making some clients feel uncomfortable. Specifically, there have been comments about your hijab and whether it might be creating barriers to client rapport. The words hit Amira like a physical blow, though she managed to keep her expression neutral. Years of navigating subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination had taught her to absorb these moments without visible reaction, even as her mind raced through a dozen different responses. I see, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning inside her. Now, I want to emphasize that this is in no way a requirement, Patricia continued, her tone becoming even more carefully modulated. Sterling Capital is committed to religious freedom and personal expression. However, as someone who cares about your career trajectory, I wanted to discuss whether you might consider making your appearance more approachable for our more conservative clientele. Amira felt her hands clench involuntarily in her lap. The hijab she wore wasn't just a piece of fabric, it was an expression of her faith, her identity, her connection to her family and heritage. It was as much a part of her as her analytical mind or her ambition. The suggestion that she should remove it to make others comfortable felt like being asked to remove a piece of her soul. Could you provide more specific details about this feedback? Amira asked, fighting to keep her voice professional. Which clients? What exactly was said? Patricia's expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. Well, as I mentioned, the feedback was anonymous. We respect the confidentiality of our clients' concerns. But the pattern was clear enough that I felt it warranted a conversation. A pattern? Amira pressed. How many instances are we talking about? Amira, Patricia said, her tone becoming more firm. I understand this might feel uncomfortable to discuss. But part of my role here is to help our employees understand the realities of client-facing positions in high-stakes finance. Sometimes that means having difficult conversations about image and perception. The HR director reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small pamphlet titled Professional Presentation Guidelines. She slid it across the desk toward Amira. I've found this resource helpful for employees who want to optimize their professional image. It covers everything from color psychology in business attire to cultural sensitivity in client interactions. Amira stared at the pamphlet without touching it. The cover featured a stock photo of diverse professionals in a boardroom, all wearing bland, conservative business attire. She wondered how many other employees had received this particular piece of literature, or if she was being given special treatment. I appreciate your concern for my career, Amira said finally, choosing her words with extreme care. Can I ask what you would recommend as next steps? Patricia's smile returned, clearly interpreting Amira's question as compliance, rather than challenge. I think you should take some time to consider how you want to position yourself for maximum career success. Talk to people you trust. Really think about what matters most to you, your personal expression or your professional advancement. The false choice hung between them like a trap. Amira felt the weight of every assumption behind Patricia's words. That faith and success were incompatible. That authenticity was a luxury she couldn't afford. That belonging required erasure. "Of course," Amira replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll certainly give this careful consideration." "Excellent," Patricia said, closing her portfolio with a satisfied snap. "I knew you'd approach this with the same analytical mindset you bring to your work. Take your time, but don't take too long. Opportunities in this business have a way of passing by quickly." As Amira stood to leave, Patricia's voice followed her to the door. "Remember, Amira, this conversation comes from wanting to see you succeed. Sometimes the most supportive thing we can do is help people understand the realities of the business world." Walking back to her desk through Sterling Capital's pristine hallways, Amira felt hollow and defeated. The corporate awards on Patricia's wall seemed to mock her with their promises of inclusion and diversity. She thought about Morrison's genuine respect for her expertise, about the careful analysis she'd built her career on, about the price she was apparently expected to pay for belonging. The autumn sunlight no longer seemed bright or promising. Instead, it felt cold and unforgiving, illuminating a path forward that seemed to require leaving essential pieces of herself behind. The autumn sunlight that had felt so unforgiving just hours earlier had given way to the warm, golden glow of evening as Amira climbed the steps to her family's brownstone in Brooklyn Heights. The familiar scent of cardamom and lamb reached her even before she opened the front door, and for the first time since leaving Patricia's office, she felt some of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. Friday dinners at the Hassan house were sacred, a weekly tradition that had anchored the family through 30 years in America. "Amira, Habibti," her mother Sarah's voice carried from the kitchen as the door closed behind her. "You're just in time. Come, help me with the rice." Amira hung her blazer in the hallway closet, her movements automatic and comforting. The house wrapped around her like a warm embrace, family photos covering every surface, her father's prayer, rug neatly folded in the corner, her mother's law books still lining the study shelves despite her retirement from legal practice years ago. This was home in a way that Sterling Capital's gleaming offices could never be. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "Something smells incredible," Amira called back, though her voice lacked its usual enthusiasm. She paused at the hallway mirror, adjusting her hijab one more time. Here, in this house, the silk fabric felt like comfort rather than controversy. Here, it was simply part of who she was. Sarah Hassan appeared in the doorway, her own hijab, a soft cream color that complemented her olive skin and warm brown eyes. At 58, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had fought battles and won them, though she'd chosen to wage her wars through patience and strategy, rather than confrontation. "You look tired, ya Ruhi," her mother said, using the endearment that had soothed Amira's worries since childhood. "Bad day at work?" Before Amira could answer, her sister Layla's voice boomed from the living room. "If it's another story about corporate idiots not appreciating your brilliance, I'm going to start making house calls to Sterling Capital with my scalpel." Amira managed her first genuine smile of the day as she entered the living room to find Layla stretched across their father's favorite armchair, still wearing her surgical scrubs. At 29, Layla had inherited their father's quiet intensity, but channeled it into fierce protectiveness of those she loved. Where Amira chose diplomacy, Layla chose direct action. "Long surgery?" Amira asked, settling onto the couch. 12 hours, Layla replied, but her dark eyes were sharp with concern as they studied her sister's face. "But let's talk about whatever's making you look like someone stole your favorite spreadsheet." Tariq Hassan emerged from his study, moving with the unhurried grace that characterized everything he did. At 62, he was a man who had learned that true power lay in patience and observation rather than noise and display. His graying beard was neatly trimmed, his simple white shirt and dark trousers giving him an almost professorial appearance that belied the sharp intelligence in his eyes. "Assalamu alaikum, Habibti," he said softly, kissing Amira's forehead. "How was your week?" The simple question, asked with such genuine care, threatened to undo the composure Amira had maintained since leaving Patricia's office. She felt tears prick at her eyes but blinked them back, not wanting to worry her family unnecessarily. "Fine, Baba," she said, but the word came out smaller than intended. Sarah appeared with a tray of tea, the delicate glasses catching the lamplight. She settled beside Amira on the couch, her presence immediately calming. "Amira, you haven't been fine since you walked through that door. What happened?" The concern in her mother's voice finally broke through Amira's defenses. The story, poured out in halting sentences, Patricia's summons, the careful corporate language, the suggestion that her hijab was making clients uncomfortable, the impossible choice between faith and career advancement. Her family listened in increasingly tense silence. She said what? Layla's voice was dangerously quiet, her medical training evident in how she seemed to be checking her sister for signs of injury. "It wasn't exactly a demand," Amira said quickly, though even as she spoke the words, she recognized them as the kind of rationalization that kept victims silent. She framed it as career advice, suggestions for advancement. Sarah's eyes flashed with an anger that reminded Amira why her mother had once been such a formidable civil rights attorney. "That's exactly how discrimination operates in corporate environments now," she said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "They've learned to dress it up in development language and concern for advancement." Tariq had remained silent throughout Amira's recounting, his expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. Now he stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Manhattan skyline glittering in the distance. "Tell me," he said quietly, still facing the window, "what do you know about Sterling Capital's business development efforts lately?" Amira frowned at the seemingly random question. "They're always pursuing new clients. Mr. Sterling mentioned they're particularly interested in landing some major institutional investors." "Why?" Instead of answering directly, Tariq walked to his study and returned with his phone. He scrolled through his contacts with the deliberate movements of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. "Baba, what are you doing?" Layla asked, her protective instincts clearly on high alert. Tariq found the number he wanted and pressed call. "Omar? Yes, it's Tariq." "Fine, alhamdulillah, and your family?" "Good, good. Listen, I need you to move forward with that Sterling Capital meeting we discussed." "Yes, next week would be perfect." "No, keep it simple for now. Standard presentation, nothing too detailed." "Excellent. Thank you, my friend." He ended the call and returned to his chair, his expression serene, but his eyes holding a glint that Amira had never seen before. "Baba," Amira said slowly. "What was that about?" Sarah and Tariq exchanged a look that spoke of decades of shared understanding. Sarah nodded slightly, a gesture so subtle that someone who didn't know them might have missed it entirely. "Amira ya Habibti," Tariq said, settling back into his chair. "There are some things about our family that we've kept private. Not from shame, but from wisdom. Your mother and I learned long ago that in America, sometimes the most powerful position is the one others don't see coming." Layla sat up straighter, her medical training making her alert to any shift in family dynamics. "What do you mean, Baba?" Tariq was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled in front of him. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that seemed to transform the very air in the room. "Sterling Capital has been trying to secure a meeting with one of their target clients for 8 months, he said simply. "A firm called Crescent Holdings. They manage approximately $3 billion in assets, and they've been very selective about their investment partnerships." Amira felt something cold settle in her stomach. "How do you know that?" Her father's smile was gentle but held. Depths she was only beginning to understand. Because, Habibti, I am Crescent Holdings, and Sterling Capital just made a very expensive mistake. The words hung in the air like a revelation that rewrote everything Amira thought she knew about her family, her father, and her own place in the world. In the space of a single sentence, the quiet man who had taught her to value patience and integrity had revealed himself as something far more complex and powerful than she had ever imagined. Outside, the city lights twinkled with the same indifference they always had, but inside the Hassan family brownstone, everything had changed. The city lights that had seemed so indifferent the night before now glittered with possibility as Amira rode the subway into Manhattan the next morning. Her father's revelation had kept her awake until nearly 3 a.m., her mind spinning through the implications of discovering that Tariq Hassan, the quiet man who still mended his own clothes and insisted on taking the bus to Friday prayers, controlled a $2-3 billion investment empire that Sterling Capital had been desperately courting. She'd replayed the conversation a dozen times, remembering the subtle shift in her father's demeanor when he'd made that phone call, the way her mother hadn't seemed surprised by the revelation, the careful way they'd both spoken about keeping things private. How many other secrets lay beneath the surface of her family's modest lifestyle? Now, walking through Sterling Capital's marble lobby, Amira felt like she was seeing everything through new eyes. The imposing portraits of the firm's founding fathers, the way the security guards nodded deferentially to senior executives, the casual arrogance that permeated every conversation. It all seemed smaller somehow, less intimidating when viewed. From the perspective of someone whose family could make or break the firm's biggest business development goal. But even as she felt a surge of confidence, another emotion gnawed at her. Uncertainty. Her father had said they would handle this, but what did that mean? And more importantly, what did she want it to mean? David Chen was already at his desk. When Amira arrived at her floor, his salt and pepper hair slightly mussed as he leaned over a stack of research reports. At 45, David had the weathered look of someone who'd spent 20 years navigating corporate politics while maintaining his principles, a balance that had earned him respect throughout the firm despite his reluctance to play the usual games. "Morning, Amira," he said, glancing up with the kind of warm smile that had made him her mentor from her first day at Sterling Capital. "How are you feeling after that presentation earlier this week? Morrison's team has been asking a lot of follow-up questions." Amira paused, considering how much to reveal. David had always been an ally, but her family's secret felt too enormous to share casually. Instead, she decided to focus on the more immediate issue. "David, can I ask you something?" She lowered her voice, glancing around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "Have you ever had to deal with image concerns from HR?" David's expression shifted immediately, his casual demeanor replaced by the alert focus of someone who'd learned to recognize danger in corporate environments. "What kind of image concerns?" Amira hesitated, then decided that if she couldn't trust David, she couldn't trust anyone at Sterling Capital. She gave him a condensed version of her conversation with Patricia, watching his face grow progressively darker with each detail. "She actually suggested you remove your hijab?" David's voice was barely controlled, his hands gripping his coffee mug so tightly his knuckles went white. "Jesus, Amira, that's not just inappropriate, it's potentially illegal." She framed it as career advice, Amira said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "Bullshit," David said flatly, then immediately apologized for his language. "Sorry, but that's exactly what it is. I've been here 15 years and I've seen Patricia pull this same routine with anyone who doesn't fit her narrow definition of Sterling Capital material." His expression grew thoughtful. "You know what happened to Jennifer Kim in equity research last year?" Amira shook her head. Same conversation, different target. Patricia told her that her accent might be challenging for clients to understand, and suggested she consider speech coaching. Jennifer was born in fucking Iowa. David's anger was palpable now. The woman left for Goldman 6 months later and just made VP. The parallels were unmistakable, and Amira felt some of her self-doubt begin to transform into righteous anger. What did you do when you first started here? Did you face anything like this? David was quiet for a moment, his expression distant. My first year, Patricia suggested I might want to think carefully about the cultural artifacts in my office. Apparently, my calligraphy scrolls were potentially confusing for clients who might not understand Chinese culture. He gestured to his current office space, which prominently featured the same scrolls. I told her that if clients couldn't handle seeing evidence that their portfolio manager had a culture and a heritage, they were probably too narrow-minded to trust with their money anyway. What happened? She backed down, but only because I'd already proven myself indispensable to 3 major clients. David leaned forward, his voice becoming more intense. The difference is, I had leverage. You need to build yours. Before Amira could ask what he meant, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was brief, but sent a chill down her spine. Ms. Hassan, this is Marcus Sterling's assistant. Mr. Sterling would like to schedule a brief meeting with you this afternoon to discuss the Morrison account. Please confirm your availability. David noticed her change in expression. Everything okay? Marcus Sterling wants to meet with me about the Morrison account, she said, showing him the text. David raised an eyebrow. That's unusual. Marcus doesn't typically get involved in individual account discussions unless something significant is happening. He paused, studying her face. You sure there's nothing else going on? 3 floors up, Marcus Sterling III was having a very different kind of morning. The call from Crescent Holdings had come at 8:30 sharp, and the conversation had left him both excited and puzzled. Omar Malik, who'd identified himself as Crescent Holdings' head of business development, had been polite but direct. They were interested in exploring a partnership with Sterling Capital and would like to schedule a formal presentation. It was exactly the kind of call Marcus had been hoping for, but something about the timing felt odd. Crescent Holdings had been unresponsive to their outreach efforts for months, and now suddenly they were reaching out just days after the Morrison presentation. It could be coincidence, but in Marcus's experience, timing in finance was rarely accidental. He was still puzzling over the connection when Patricia Webb knocked on his office door. Marcus, do you have a moment? Patricia entered without waiting. For an answer, her usual confident demeanor slightly strained. I wanted to discuss the Morrison account and some concerns I have about client management going forward. Marcus gestured to the chair across from his desk, his attention split between Patricia's words and the Crescent Holdings call. What kind of concerns? Well, as you know, I've been monitoring our client-facing protocols very carefully, Patricia began, settling into her corporate speak mode. And I've had some feedback about potential cultural sensitivity issues that might impact our ability to build strong client relationships. Such as? Patricia launched into what was clearly a prepared presentation about the importance of cultural alignment and client comfort levels, but Marcus found his attention wandering. Something about her timing bothered him. First, the mysterious Crescent Holdings call. Now Patricia was raising concerns about cultural issues. In his experience, HR directors didn't usually involve themselves in client management unless there was a specific problem. Patricia, he interrupted, are you talking about a specific employee? She hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Pause that Marcus, trained to read subtle market signals, caught immediately. I prefer not to name individuals unless absolutely necessary, but I do think we need to have broader conversations about presentation standards and client expectations. Marcus's phone buzzed with another message from his assistant, this one containing Crescent Holdings' preferred meeting dates. As he glanced at the screen, a thought began forming in the back of his mind, one that made him deeply uncomfortable. Patricia, I'm going to need specific details about these concerns, he said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone that had made him successful in negotiations. If we're talking about changing policies that affect our employees, I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Outside Marcus's office, the normal rhythm of Sterling Capital continued. Analysts crafting reports, phones ringing with client calls, the steady hum of money being managed and moved. But underneath the surface, currents were shifting in ways that would soon reshape everything about the firm's carefully constructed hierarchy. In her cubicle, Amira stared at Marcus Sterling's meeting request, unaware that 2 floors above her, conversations were taking place that would soon collide with her family's hidden influence in ways that none of them could yet imagine. The Yi. Morning light streaming through Sterling Capital's windows carried the promise of revelation, though whether it would bring justice or chaos remained to be seen. The morning light that had carried such promise of revelation was now giving way to the soft amber glow of evening as Amira sat across from her father in his study, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of a man who preferred substance over style. Books in Arabic and English lined every wall. Financial newspapers were stacked on side tables, and a simple wooden desk held 3 monitors displaying market data from around the world. "I know you have questions, Habibti," Tariq said quietly, settling into his worn leather chair with the deliberate movements of someone who had learned that important conversations required patience. "Your mother and I discussed it last night after you went to bed. We think it's time you understood the full picture." Amira had barely slept, her mind racing through fragments of conversation and half-remembered details that suddenly seemed significant. Her father's mysterious phone calls over the years, the way certain people at the mosque deferred to him, her mother's occasional comments about keeping a low profile. She'd attributed it all to the natural respect accorded to immigrant elders, but now she wondered what else she'd missed. "Baba," she said carefully, "when you said you are Crescent Holdings, what exactly did you mean?" Tariq reached for a small, brass key from his desk drawer and unlocked a filing cabinet that Amira had always assumed contained tax documents and family papers. Instead, he withdrew a thick folder marked with the Crescent Holdings logo, a simple, elegant design she now realized she'd seen on his business cards, though he'd always described himself simply as a financial consultant. 30 years ago, when your mother and I came to this country, I had 2 suitcases and a business degree from the American University of Beirut, he began, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone telling a story he'd rehearsed but never shared. What I also had was something more valuable, an understanding of how capital flows between the Middle East and the West, and how American firms consistently undervalued opportunities in emerging markets. He opened the folder, revealing financial statements, investment portfolios, and partnership agreements that painted a picture of staggering complexity and success. I started with $50,000, our entire savings, and a conviction that American investors were missing opportunities because they didn't understand the markets I knew intimately. Amira leaned forward, studying documents that showed annual returns consistently outperforming major indices. "But why didn't you ever tell us?" "Layla and we thought you worked as a consultant for other people's businesses." "Because, Yaruhi, in America, being successful while Muslim and Arab means walking a very fine line." Sarah Hassan had appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray of tea, her expression both proud and protective. "Your father learned early that drawing attention to our family's wealth could bring the wrong kind of scrutiny." Tariq nodded, accepting a glass of tea from his wife. "After September 11th, after the financial crisis, after every moment when this country looked for scapegoats, we decided that success was best achieved quietly. Let others make the headlines and draw the attention. We would build something sustainable." "But $2? $3 billion? Amira's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Baba, that's not just successful, that's enormous. It's the result of 30 years of patient investing, careful partnerships, and understanding markets that others ignored or feared," Tariq explained. When American firms saw risk in Middle Eastern markets, I saw opportunity. When they couldn't navigate cultural complexities in Southeast Asia, I built relationships. When they abandoned emerging markets during crises, I doubled down. Sarah settled into the chair beside Amira, her presence both comforting and grounding. Your father has always believed that the best revenge against prejudice is competence so undeniable that it cannot be ignored. Which brings us to your situation at Sterling Capital, Tarek said, his tone becoming more serious. For 8 months they have been trying to secure a meeting with Crescent Holdings. Their pursuit has been aggressive. Multiple outreach attempts, research into our investment strategies, even attempts to identify our key decision-makers through mutual contacts. Amira felt pieces clicking into place with almost audible precision. The Morrison presentation, Marcus's reaction, when it went well, the sudden interest in promoting emerging markets expertise. Sterling Capital is desperate for institutional clients who can validate their global investment capabilities, Tariq continued. Crescent Holdings represents exactly the kind of partnership that could transform their business. What they don't realize is that they employ the daughter of the man they've been courting. The irony was so complete, so perfectly absurd, that Amira might have laughed if the implications weren't so staggering. And Patricia wants me to remove my hijab to make clients more comfortable. Yes, Sarah said, her voice tight with controlled anger. The same Patricia Webb who will sit in a conference room next week, trying to convince your father that Sterling Capital values diversity and cultural competence. Tariq pulled another document from the folder, a detailed dossier on Sterling Capital that included organizational charts, financial performance data, and what appeared to be background information on key personnel. We always research our potential partners thoroughly. Patricia Webb's track record on diversity issues is concerning. Amira scanned the document, recognizing names and seeing patterns she'd missed while working within the system. You've been planning this. Not planning, Tariq corrected gently. Preparing. There's a difference. When you told us about Patricia's ultimatum last night, it simply accelerated a timeline that was already in motion. What timeline? Sarah and Tariq exchanged another of their meaningful looks, a communication system perfected over decades of partnership. Sarah nodded slightly. Amira, Tariq said, Crescent Holdings is at a point where we need to expand our operational capabilities. We've been considering partnerships with established American firms, but we've also been exploring the possibility of bringing the business more directly into the family. The words hung in the air, loaded with implications that made Amira's head spin. You mean? I mean that your career path doesn't have to depend on whether Patricia Webb considers your hijab acceptable, Tariq said simply. You have options you didn't know existed. Amira stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. That had seemed so different just 24 hours ago. Manhattan's skyline looked the same, but her place in it had fundamentally shifted. She was no longer just a junior portfolio manager hoping to climb Sterling Capital's ladder. She was the daughter of one of the most successful investors they'd never heard of. What happens now? She asked without turning around. Now, Tariq said. You decide what kind of justice you want to seek, and we decide together how to use this opportunity to create the change you want to see. Outside, the city hummed with its usual indifferent energy, but inside the Hassan family study, the balance of power had shifted in ways that would soon reshape everything Amira thought she knew about corporate hierarchies, family loyalty, and the true meaning of leverage. The revelation was complete, but the real work was just beginning. The real work that had just begun manifested itself immediately the following Monday morning as Amira sat at her desk, surrounded by the familiar sounds of Sterling Capital's trading floor, but seeing everything through completely different eyes. The weekend had been a blur of family strategy sessions, whispered conversations, and careful planning. Now, armed with knowledge that felt both empowering and overwhelming, She was ready to begin what her father had called gathering intelligence. David Chen approached her cubicle with his usual Monday morning coffee and a stack of research reports, but his expression carried the concern that had lingered since their conversation about Patricia's ultimatum. "How was your weekend?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her desk. "Did you give any more thought to what we discussed?" Amira looked up from her computer, where she'd been carefully reviewing Sterling Capital's client development database. "Actually, David, I've been thinking about it quite a lot. Can I ask you something? How desperate is the firm for new major institutional clients right now?" David raised an eyebrow at the seemingly random question. "Pretty desperate, actually. Marcus has been pushing hard for big wins this quarter. The partners are nervous about some of the larger accounts we lost last year." He paused. "Why do you ask?" "Just trying to understand the bigger picture," Amira said carefully. "I've been wondering if there's a connection between the pressure for new business and some of the cultural sensitivity issues you mentioned." Before David could respond, Amira's computer chimed with a new email. The sender made her pulse quicken. Patricia Webb, subject line, follow-up, professional development discussion. "Amira," the email read, "I hope you had a productive weekend to consider our conversation. I'd like to schedule a brief follow-up meeting this week to discuss your thoughts and any decisions you've made regarding our discussion about professional presentation. Please let me know your availability. Best regards, Patricia." David noticed her expression change. "Everything okay?" "Patricia wants another meeting," Amira said, showing him the email. "She's following up on her professional development suggestions." David's jaw tightened. "She's not going to let this drop, is she?" "No," Amira said quietly. "I don't think she is." She took a deep breath, making a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. "David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to trust me. Can you help me document Patricia's pattern of behavior with minority employees? Quietly?" David studied her face for a long moment. "Amira, what aren't you telling me?" "I can't explain everything right now," she said honestly. "But I think there might be an opportunity to address this issue in a way that creates real change. Not just for me, but for others too. But I need information first." 3 floors above them, Marcus Sterling III was having what he'd intended to be a routine Monday morning meeting with his business development team, but the conversation had taken an unexpected turn when Patricia Webb had requested to join. "Marcus, I really think we need to discuss our client-facing standards before we pursue any major new institutional relationships," Patricia was saying, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being heard in executive meetings. "Cultural sensitivity is becoming increasingly important in our sector." Marcus set down his coffee and studied Patricia's face. The Crescent Holdings meeting was scheduled for Thursday, and he'd spent the weekend reviewing everything he could find about the mysterious firm. What little public information existed suggested sophisticated international investors with particular expertise in cross-cultural business relationships, exactly the kind of clients Sterling Capital needed. "Patricia, are you suggesting we have cultural sensitivity issues?" Marcus asked directly. "I'm suggesting we need to be proactive about ensuring our client presentations are optimally positioned for success," she replied smoothly. "Sometimes that means having difficult conversations with employees about professional presentation standards." Marcus felt a familiar unease settle in his stomach. In his 20 years running Sterling Capital, he'd learned to recognize when HR conversations contained subtext that could create legal liabilities. Difficult conversations about what specifically? Before Patricia could answer, Marcus's assistant knocked on the conference room door. "Mr. Sterling? I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have Omar Malik from Crescent Holdings on line 1. He says it's regarding Thursday's meeting." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "Excuse me for a moment, Patricia." He picked up the phone. "Mr. Malik, good morning. I hope everything is still on schedule for Thursday." Absolutely, Mr. Sterling, came the smooth, professional voice. I'm calling to confirm a few details about the presentation format. Mr. Hassan is particularly interested in understanding Sterling Capital's approach to cultural competency in international markets. The phrase sent a chill down Marcus's spine, particularly given Patricia's presence and her recent emphasis on cultural sensitivity. Of course, we're prepared to discuss our global capabilities comprehensively. Excellent. One other thing. Mr. Hassan has a particular interest in emerging markets expertise. I understand you have some talented analysts in that area. Marcus found himself thinking immediately of Amira's Morrison presentation. Yes, we have some exceptional emerging markets capabilities. Our analysts have both academic expertise and cultural insights that give us significant advantages in those sectors. Perfect. Mr. Hassan values authentic cultural understanding, rather than superficial diversity initiatives. He's found that firms with genuine cultural competency tend to outperform those that merely pay lip service to inclusion. The words seemed to echo with particular significance given Patricia's presence. I completely agree, Marcus said carefully. Sterling Capital is committed to substantive diversity, not just optics. After ending the call, Marcus turned back to Patricia, who had been listening to his side of the conversation with growing unease. Patricia, he said slowly, I want you to be very careful about any conversations you're having with employees about cultural presentation. If Crescent Holdings is evaluating us on cultural competency, we cannot afford to have any issues in that area. Patricia's composed mask slipped slightly. Of course, Marcus, I would never suggest anything that could compromise our business relationships. Good, Marcus said firmly, because this Crescent Holdings partnership could be transformational for the firm. I need everyone focused on demonstrating our best capabilities, not managing perceived problems. As Patricia left the meeting, Marcus found himself thinking about the timing of everything. Malik's emphasis on cultural competency, Patricia's sudden focus on presentation standards, and the nagging feeling that there were connections he wasn't seeing. Back on the trading floor, Amira was making connections of her own. David had quietly provided her with information about 3 other minority employees who had received similar development advice from Patricia over the past 2 years. The pattern was clear and documented, creating exactly the kind of evidence base her mother had taught her was essential for any legal challenge. But more importantly, she was beginning to understand how to use her family's hidden leverage strategically. Thursday's meeting would put Patricia in the same room as Tariq Hassan, though Patricia would have no idea she was facing the father of the employee she'd been trying to force into compliance. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would reveal not just individual prejudices, but the entire system that enabled them. And for the first time since Patricia's ultimatum, Amira felt like she was holding cards instead of just hoping for mercy. The strategic maneuvering had begun, and the balance of power was already shifting in ways that none of Sterling Capital's executives could yet comprehend. The balance of power that had been shifting in ways Sterling Capital's executives couldn't comprehend was about to become startlingly clear as Thursday morning arrived with crisp autumn air and the kind of light that made Manhattan's glass towers gleam like monuments to ambition. In Sterling Capital's premier conference room on the 34th floor, Marcus Sterling III stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city wake up below while his team made final preparations for what could be the most important client meeting of the year. The presentation materials are ready, sir, his assistant announced from the doorway. And catering has set up the refreshments as requested. Mr. Malik confirmed that Mr. Hassan's team will arrive at 10 o'clock sharp. Marcus nodded, adjusting his tie one final time. He'd chosen his most conservative suit, navy blue, impeccably tailored, designed to project exactly the kind of old money stability that institutional investors expected from Sterling Capital. Around the polished conference table, his senior team was making their own final preparations. Patricia Webb reviewing her diversity and inclusion talking points, David Chen organizing the emerging markets portfolio data, and 3 other senior portfolio managers arranging their respective sector analyses. Remember, Marcus said, addressing the room, Crescent Holdings represents exactly the kind of sophisticated international client we need to establish our global credibility. Mr. Hassan has built his reputation on cross-cultural investment expertise, so I want everyone focused on demonstrating our cultural competency, not just our financial performance. Patricia's smile was perfectly professional, but something in her posture had been slightly off all week. Ever since Marcus's pointed comments about cultural sensitivity, she'd seemed more guarded, more careful about her usual authoritative presence in senior meetings. At exactly 10 o'clock, the conference room door opened to admit Omar Malik, a distinguished man in his 50s with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. Behind him walked Tariq Hassan, and Patricia Webb felt the blood drain from her face. The man entering Sterling Capital's conference room was unremarkable in his appearance. Medium height, graying beard, simple dark suit that suggested competence rather than ostentation. But Patricia recognized him immediately from the family photos that had decorated Amira's desk for 2 years. This was Amira Hassan's father, the quiet immigrant she'd assumed worked in some modest consulting capacity. Mr. Sterling, Omar said, with practiced professionalism, please allow me to introduce Tariq Hassan, founder and CEO of Crescent Holdings. Marcus stepped forward with his most confident smile, extending his hand. Mr. Hassan, it's a genuine pleasure to finally meet. We've been hoping for this opportunity for quite some time. Tariq's handshake was firm but unhurried, his dark eyes taking in the room with the kind of patient observation that suggested he missed very little. Thank you for accommodating our schedule, Mr. Sterling. I'm interested to learn more about Sterling Capital's capabilities. As introductions continued around the table, Patricia struggled to maintain her composure. When Marcus introduced her as our head of human resources and cultural initiatives, Tariq's eyes met hers with an expression that seemed both polite and subtly evaluative. Ms. Webb, Tariq said simply, inclining his head, I look forward to learning about Sterling Capital's approach to building inclusive, culturally competent teams. The words were innocuous enough, but something in his tone made Patricia's stomach clench with growing dread. She managed a professional smile. We're very proud of our diversity and inclusion initiatives, Mr. Hassan. I'm sure you are, Tariq replied mildly, settling into his chair with the unhurried movements of someone completely comfortable with his position. Marcus launched into Sterling Capital's standard institutional client presentation, highlighting their assets under management, their historical performance, and their global investment capabilities. It was a polished performance, honed through hundreds of similar meetings, but Tariq listened with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was evaluating more than just financial metrics. Your emerging markets performance is particularly impressive, Tariq commented during David Chen's section of the presentation. What gives Sterling Capital its competitive advantage in those sectors? David glanced at Marcus before responding. We have analysts with both academic expertise and genuine cultural insights into the markets we target. Real understanding of local business practices, political dynamics, and cultural factors that impact investment outcomes. Cultural insights, Tariq repeated thoughtfully. And how does Sterling Capital ensure that this cultural competency is reflected throughout your organization, not just in your research capabilities? The question hung in the air with particular weight, and Marcus felt himself glancing involuntarily at Patricia. We have comprehensive diversity and inclusion programs, he said carefully. We believe that diverse perspectives strengthen our investment capabilities. I see, Tariq said. And do you find that your clients appreciate this diversity? Or do you encounter resistance from more traditional institutional investors? Patricia found herself speaking before she'd fully considered her words. Well, Mr. Hassan, We do try to be sensitive to our clients' comfort levels. Sometimes cultural differences can create communication barriers that require careful management. The silence that followed her comment seemed to stretch for an eternity. Tariq's expression remained perfectly neutral, but something in his stillness suggested that Patricia had just made a significant error. Communication barriers, Tariq said slowly. Could you elaborate on what kinds of cultural differences you find problematic? Patricia realized she was walking into dangerous territory, but felt compelled to continue. Oh, nothing problematic. Exactly. Just that some of our more conservative clients prefer traditional business presentations. Clear communication without potential cultural distractions. Cultural distractions, Tariq repeated, his voice taking on a quality that made everyone in the room slightly uncomfortable. Such as? Marcus intervened, sensing that the conversation was veering into areas that could damage the relationship. Mr. Hassan, what we mean is that Sterling Capital focuses on substantive cultural competency rather than superficial diversity initiatives. We believe in authentic inclusion rather than tokenism. Tariq nodded slowly, his gaze moving around the table to study each face. That's very interesting, Mr. Sterling. In my experience, firms that truly understand cultural competency tend to have employees who can authentically represent diverse perspectives. Not employees who are asked to minimize their cultural identity for client comfort. The implication of his words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Patricia felt sweat forming along her hairline as she began to understand that this conversation was somehow connected to issues she thought she'd been handling discreetly. I wonder, Tariq continued conversationally, whether Sterling Capital's emerging markets expertise includes employees who have genuine connections to those regions, personal understanding that goes beyond academic analysis. Absolutely, David said quickly, his loyalty to Amira overriding his confusion about the direction of the conversation. We have analysts with direct cultural connections to the markets they cover. Their insights have been invaluable for our client relationships. And these employees, Tariq said, his attention turning back to Patricia, do they find Sterling Capital's environment supportive of their cultural identity? Or do they face pressure to assimilate in ways that might compromise their authentic perspectives? Patricia felt the trap closing around her, though she still didn't fully understand its dimensions. We encourage all our employees to present professionally and consider client comfort, she said carefully. Client comfort, Tariq repeated one final time. Mr. Sterling, I think this gives me exactly the insight into Sterling Capital's culture that I was hoping to understand. As the meeting continued with discussion of investment strategies and partnership structures, Patricia sat in growing terror, finally beginning to comprehend that the quiet man across the table somehow knew exactly what conversations she'd been having with his daughter. The dramatic irony that had been building for days was about to reach its devastating conclusion, and Patricia Webb was beginning to realize that she had systematically discriminated against the daughter of the very client Sterling Capital needed most. The dramatic irony that had reached its devastating conclusion was about to explode into full revelation as the formal presentation concluded, and Omar Malik efficiently gathered the materials scattered across Sterling Capital's conference table. The morning had stretched into early afternoon, filled with detailed discussions of investment strategies, risk management protocols, and partnership structures. But Tariq Hassan had remained largely observational, asking pointed questions that seemed to probe beyond financial capabilities into the character of the organization itself. Mr. Sterling, Tariq said as the other attendees began filing out, I wonder if we might have a brief private conversation. There are some aspects of Sterling Capital's corporate culture I'd like to discuss in more detail. Marcus felt his pulse quicken, unsure whether this request signaled serious interest or serious concerns. Of course, Mr. Hassan, my office would be more comfortable for a private discussion. Actually, Tariq said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to fill the conference room. I think Ms. Webb should join us. Her insights into Sterling Capital's approach to cultural competency seem particularly relevant to my evaluation. Patricia felt her legs weaken slightly, but managed to maintain her professional composure as they moved to Marcus's corner office. The space was designed to intimidate: floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, original oil paintings of maritime scenes, and a massive desk that had belonged to Marcus's grandfather. But somehow, Tariq Hassan's presence transformed the power dynamics entirely. "Please, sit," Marcus said, gesturing to the leather chairs arranged around a small conference table near the windows. "Can I offer you anything? Coffee? Water?" "Thank you, no," Tariq replied, settling into his chair with the unhurried movements that had characterized his entire morning. "Mr. Sterling, Ms. Webb, I appreciate you taking this additional time. The conversation we've had today has been quite illuminating." Marcus leaned forward slightly, trying to read Tariq's expression. "I hope we've demonstrated Sterling Capital's capabilities to your satisfaction." "Oh, you've demonstrated a great deal," Tariq said mildly. "In fact, you've given me insights into your organization that I suspect you didn't intend to share." The words hung in the air with ominous weight. Patricia found herself gripping the arms of her chair, her professional instincts warning her that this conversation was about to go somewhere dangerous. "Mr. Hassan," she said carefully, "if there are concerns about our cultural competency programs, I'd be happy to provide more detailed information about our diversity initiatives." Tariq's smile was gentle but contained depths that made Patricia's stomach clench with growing dread. "Ms. Webb, I'm actually quite interested in your diversity initiatives, particularly how they apply to your current employees." "I'm not sure I understand," Patricia replied, though her voice had lost some of its usual confidence. "Let me be more specific," Tariq said, his tone remaining conversational, but taking on an edge that made both Marcus and Patricia pay closer attention. "I'm curious about how Sterling Capital handles situations where employees' religious or cultural identity might make traditional clients uncomfortable." Marcus felt warning bells going off in his head. "Mr. Hassan, I want to assure you that Sterling Capital is fully committed to religious freedom and cultural inclusion." "I'm sure you believe that, Mr. Sterling," Tariq replied. "But I'm more interested in how this commitment translates into daily practice. For instance, what would happen if an employee wore religious garments that some clients found distracting?" Patricia's face had gone pale, but she forced herself to respond. "Well, we would work with the employee to find solutions that balanced personal expression with professional requirements." "Solutions," Tariq repeated thoughtfully. "Such as asking the employee to remove their religious garments to make clients more comfortable?" The question landed like a physical blow. Patricia felt the room spinning slightly as she began to understand that this conversation was no longer hypothetical. "Mr. Hassan," Marcus said slowly, "are you suggesting that we've had specific incidents involving religious discrimination?" Tariq reached into his briefcase and withdrew a folder. From it, he pulled a photograph, a professional headshot of Amira Hassan in her navy blazer and charcoal hijab, the same photo that had accompanied her employee profile since her first day at Sterling Capital. "I'd like you both to meet my daughter," Tariq said quietly. "Amira Hassan. She's worked as a junior portfolio manager here at Sterling Capital for 2 years. Perhaps you've heard of her?" The photograph seemed to burn in the air between them. Marcus stared at it in growing horror, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place with devastating clarity. Patricia felt the blood drain completely from her face as she realized the magnitude of her error. "Your daughter," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yes," Tariq confirmed. "The same Amira Hassan who delivered such an impressive presentation to James Morrison earlier this week. The same Amira Hassan who has been building Sterling Capital's emerging markets expertise with the kind of cultural insights you've been showcasing to potential clients." Patricia tried to speak but found her voice completely gone. The implications were cascading through her mind like dominoes falling. Every conversation with Amira, every suggestion about approachability, every veiled ultimatum about religious expression. Mr. Hassan, Marcus began, his voice thick with dawning comprehension. If there have been any incidents involving your daughter? Incidents, Tariq interrupted gently. That's an interesting word choice, Mr. Sterling. What Ms. Webb described to my daughter wasn't an incident. It was a systematic attempt to force her to choose between her faith and her career advancement. He opened the folder wider, revealing documents that Patricia recognized with growing terror. Email exchanges, meeting notes, and what appeared to be a detailed timeline of every interaction she'd had with Amira over the past week. Ms. Webb, Tariq continued, his voice never rising above conversational level but carrying the weight of absolute authority. You told my daughter that her hijab was making clients uncomfortable. You suggested she consider making her appearance more approachable for conservative clients. You provided her with professional presentation guidelines designed to help her optimize her image. Each accusation hit Patricia like a physical blow. Mr. Hassan, I was trying to help her career development. You were trying to force my daughter to abandon her religious identity to satisfy your assumptions about client prejudices, Tariq said, his quiet voice somehow more devastating than shouting would have been. You took a brilliant analyst whose cultural expertise has enhanced Sterling Capital's capabilities and tried to pressure her into erasure. Marcus felt the room spinning around him as he realized the full scope of the disaster. Mr. Hassan, if Ms. Webb made those suggestions, they absolutely do not represent Sterling Capital's values or policies. Tariq's smile was gentle but implacable. Mr. Sterling, what they represent is exactly why I needed to have this conversation in person. You've spent the morning showcasing your firm's cultural competency, while your HR director has been systematically discriminating against the employee who provides much of that competency. The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia sat, frozen in her chair, her career crumbling around her as she understood that she had destroyed not just her own position, but potentially Sterling Capital's most important business opportunity. The question now, Tariq said quietly, is what Sterling Capital intends to do about it. The question of what Sterling Capital intended to do about it hung in Marcus Sterling's office, like smoke from a fire that was rapidly consuming everything he'd built over 2 decades of careful reputation management. The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds before Marcus found his voice, though it came out smaller and more strained than he'd intended. Mr. Hassan, he said slowly, I need you to understand that what you're describing, if it occurred as you've outlined, represents a complete violation of everything Sterling Capital claims to stand for. Tariq's expression remained impassive, but his dark eyes held a depth that suggested he was evaluating every word, every gesture, every nuance of Marcus's response. If it occurred, Mr. Sterling? The gentle challenge in those 4 words made Marcus realize he was already making critical errors. I apologize. I misspoke. What I mean is that these actions are completely unacceptable, and I need to understand the full scope of what happened so we can address it appropriately. Patricia finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Mr. Hassan, I want you to know that my conversations with Amira were intended to help her succeed in a challenging industry. I never meant to suggest that she should compromise her religious beliefs. Tariq turned his attention to Patricia with the kind of focused calm that somehow felt more intimidating than anger. Ms. Webb, you told my daughter that anonymous clients had complained about her hijab making them uncomfortable. You suggested she consider making her appearance more approachable. You provided her with professional presentation guidelines. Are you claiming these conversations didn't happen? No, they happened, Patricia admitted, her professional composure finally cracking. But they were career guidance discussions, not discrimination. Career guidance, Tariq repeated with the same quiet intensity he'd used during the morning's presentation. You advised my daughter that her religious expression was a barrier to her professional advancement. In what way is that not discrimination? Marcus felt sweat forming along his collar as he realized the legal implications of what Tariq was describing. More immediately, he understood that the $2-3 billion partnership he'd been courting for months was evaporating before his eyes. Mr. Hassan, he said desperately, what can Sterling Capital do to address this situation? How can we make this right? Tariq was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Marcus and Patricia before settling on the photograph of Amira that still lay on the conference table. That's an interesting question, Mr. Sterling. What do you think would constitute making this right? The question felt like a test, and Marcus understood that his answer would determine not just Sterling Capital's business relationship with Crescent Holdings, but potentially the future of his firm. Patricia needs to be held accountable for her actions. Amira deserves a formal apology and appropriate compensation for what she's endured. And we need to implement systematic changes to ensure this never happens again. Ms. Webb, Tariq said, turning back to Patricia, do you agree with Mr. Sterling's assessment? Patricia looked trapped, her usual corporate confidence completely abandoned. I accept that my approach may have been misunderstood, and I'm willing to apologize to Amira for any distress I may have caused. May have caused, Tariq noted. May have been misunderstood. Even now, you're unable to acknowledge the reality of what you did. Marcus made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. Patricia, I think you should return to your office. I'll be speaking with you separately about your future with Sterling Capital. As Patricia left, her departure marked by the soft click of the office door, Marcus found himself alone with the man whose approval could save or destroy his firm's prospects. Mr. Hassan, he said quietly, I want you to know that Patricia's actions don't represent Sterling Capital's values. But I also understand that saying that isn't enough. What would you consider appropriate consequences? Tariq studied Marcus for a long moment. Mr. Sterling, consequences are less important to me than understanding whether this represents systemic issues or an isolated failure of judgment. I honestly don't know, Marcus admitted, but I intend to find out. Good, Tariq said, gathering the documents from the table. Because my decision about partnering with Sterling Capital will depend largely on what you discover and how you address it. 2 hours later, Amira sat in David Chen's office, watching through the glass walls as Patricia Webb cleaned out her desk under the supervision of security. The sight should have felt like vindication, but instead, Amira found herself experiencing a complex mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and an unexpected sense of responsibility for the chaos unfolding around her. Marcus suspended her pending a full investigation, David explained, his voice carrying a mixture of satisfaction and concern. Legal is reviewing all her personnel decisions from the past 3 years to identify patterns of discriminatory behavior. And the Crescent Holdings partnership? Amira asked, though she already knew the answer. Officially, it's under review pending the outcome of the investigation, David said. Unofficially, I think your father holds all the cards now. Amira's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Sterling's assistant. Mr. Sterling would like to meet with you at your earliest convenience to discuss your experience at Sterling Capital and your future with the firm. He wants to see me, she told David, showing him the message. David nodded. He should. The question is what you want from this situation. It was a question Amira had been wrestling with since her father's revelation. She had leverage now, more leverage than any junior portfolio manager should reasonably possess. But with that power came responsibility for how she chose to use it. An hour later, sitting across from Marcus Sterling in the same office where her father had delivered his devastating revelation, Amira found herself in the unprecedented position of negotiating from strength rather than vulnerability. Amira, Marcus began, his usual authoritative demeanor replaced by something more humble. I owe you an apology that goes far beyond anything Patricia said or did. As the leader of this firm, I created an environment where discrimination could flourish unchecked. Mr. Sterling, Amira replied carefully, I appreciate the apology, but I'm more interested in what comes next. Marcus nodded. We'd like to offer you a promotion to senior portfolio manager, effective immediately, a significant salary increase, and a formal role leading our emerging markets division. The offer was everything she'd worked toward for 2 years, but Amira found herself thinking about her family's expectations, her father's hidden empire, and the choice between working within systems or working to change them. Can I have some time to consider the offer? She asked. Of course, Marcus said. But Amira, I hope you'll also consider what your presence here could mean for other employees who might face similar challenges. Your voice, your perspective. Sterling Capital needs them now more than ever. As Amira left Marcus's office, she understood that her decision would determine not just her own future, but the kind of change she wanted to create in the world. 6 months later, Amira Hassan stood at the podium of the Financial Women's Association annual conference, looking out at an audience of nearly 300 professionals, her charcoal silk hijab catching the stage lights as she adjusted the microphone. The same piece of fabric that Patricia Webb had once called a distraction now felt like armor, a symbol of the authenticity she'd fought to preserve and the changes she'd helped create. When someone in authority tells you that your identity is a barrier to your success, she began, her voice clear and confident, they're asking you to choose between who you are and what you might become. But what I learned is that the most powerful choice is refusing to make that choice at all. In the audience, David Chen smiled with pride. As Sterling Capital's new Chief Diversity Officer, a position created specifically to address the systemic issues Amira's case had revealed, he'd been instrumental in the firm's transformation. Patricia Webb's investigation had uncovered a pattern of discriminatory behavior affecting 7 employees over 4 years, leading to policy overhauls and cultural changes that had made Sterling Capital a model for authentic inclusion in finance. Amira had chosen to stay at Sterling Capital, accepting the promotion to senior portfolio manager, while also taking on the role of cultural competency advisor. Her emerging markets division had grown by 40% under her leadership, with clients specifically requesting her expertise. The Morrison account had expanded into a $500 million partnership, and James Morrison had become one of her strongest professional advocates. The morning I walked into HR and was told my hijab made clients uncomfortable, I felt like I had to choose between my faith and my career, Amira continued. What I discovered was that I had allies I didn't know existed, mentors who stood up for me, family members who had my back in ways I never imagined, and ultimately, an organization capable of change when confronted with truth. The Crescent Holdings partnership had materialized into a $400 million investment relationship, with Tariq Hassan serving on Sterling Capital's newly formed Cultural Advisory Board. His quiet influence had helped reshape not just the firm's policies, but its understanding of how authentic diversity strengthened business outcomes. As Amira concluded her speech, a young woman in the front row raised her hand. She wore a colorful head wrap and had the eager expression of someone early in her career. Ms. Hassan, I'm starting at an investment firm next month, and I'm worried about facing similar challenges. What advice would you give? Amira smiled, remembering her own fears and uncertainties. Don't let anyone convince you that authenticity is a luxury you can't afford. Your perspective, your background, your faith, whatever makes you different, those aren't obstacles to overcome. They're advantages to leverage, and if an organization can't see that value, then they're not worthy of your talent. Later, as she packed up her materials, Amira reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The scared junior analyst, who had once considered compromising her values, was gone, replaced by someone who understood that real power came not from fitting in, but from standing up. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. "Proud of you, Habibti. Change happens." One brave choice at a time. Outside the conference hall, Manhattan's lights twinkled with the same indifference they'd always shown. But Amira Hassan walked among them as someone who had learned that sometimes the most radical act is simply refusing to disappear. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us.